So first, a bit of ground clearing. We're talking about, our focus is what we might call propositional ignorance. So it's the kind of ignorance that corresponds to lack of true belief or lack of knowledge or what have you. It's of a proposition. So there's other kinds of ignorance that might be in the vicinity. So here's one. We could contrast between ignorance of versus ignorance about. So take the second law of thermodynamics. Presumably, everyone here is aware that such a thing exists. So in that sense, you're not ignorant of it. But I take it most of us are ignorant about it, right? We couldn't say what it is, right? We couldn't give us an explanation of it. So that's the second kind there. If that's propositional ignorance, it's the ignorance about that we're interested in. But there is this other kind, ignorance of, a kind of an acquaintance sort of relation that's in play there. And that's a different sort of thing. And in the literature, people talk about other kinds of ignorance. I mean, I'm not going to say too much about this, but some people talk about sort of social structures as generating ignorance, whereas sometimes they seem to mean something other than propositional ignorance. I might say a little bit about this as we go along, but for our purposes, we're focusing on propositional ignorance, right? Because that's what the standard accounts are focusing on. And that just seems to be like a core notion of ignorance, right? It's ignorance about such and such. Two other bits of ground clearing, which most people don't do, but as we'll see, they're kind of important. Notice our standard accounts, they're both absence accounts, right? They're saying ignorance is, and then they're giving you the absence of something. Structurally speaking, absence accounts have a worry, which is they tend to be very broad in their reach. I mean, there are all kinds of things, like that chair, tectonic plates, the planet Venus, and so forth, that lack knowledge that P, and lack true beliefs that P, pick any P you like, right? I mean, they're very easy for something to satisfy that condition, the absence condition. But we don't tend to ascribe ignorance to tables and chairs and tectonic plates and so forth, and planets. Right? So that doesn't seem to be the sorts of thing that ignorance is applicable to. But the absence claim would apply just as much to them. A related issue here is falsehoods. I mean, everybody lacks knowledge of falsehoods, because you can't know a falsehood. Everybody lacks true beliefs. Pick any falsehood you like, we all lack true beliefs in it, we all lack knowledge of it. You can't have a true belief in a falsehood, you can't have knowledge of a falsehood. And yet on both those views, it seems on the face of it, we would be thereby ignorant of them. Now people generally people in this debate don't discuss those issues at all. I think they just think, well, it's kind of obvious that we should restrict the view in some way to exclude those cases. And indeed, you can see what the restriction would be. So in the first case, you restrict it. You say, well, look, ignorance only applies to believers or knowers. It doesn't apply to things that aren't. It doesn't apply to tectonic plates, because they're not believers or knowers. In the second case, you say, well, ignorance only applies to truths. It doesn't apply to falsehoods. But it's an interesting question. Where does that restriction come from? What's the principal basis for that restriction? And the reason why I mention it is because I think what I'm going to say later on will give us a principal basis for restriction. Whereas now it's kind of ad hoc. We're just sort of throwing it out there as a way of getting rid of a problem. Okay, so why do I think the standard accounts are wrong? I want to give you three cases. I could give you more, but I just want to focus on three to keep it simple. And they're kind of in ascending order, as you'll see, in terms of the kind of problem they pose. So I want to start off with pointless truths. There are all kinds of things which we could easily know or have true beliefs in, which we don't. And we don't because, well, partly because we don't care, but also because we're, more importantly for our purposes, because we're quite right not to care. They're not of interest. So pick your favourite example of pointless truth. You know, how many blades of grass there are on the outside? How many spoons there are in the third drawer to the left in the room next door? How many pairs of socks I've got? You know, whatever you like. Just pick a pointless truth. Don't be misled, by the way. Some of these things are practically hard to discover, right? So a lot of people talk about blades of grass or grains of sand, and of course the thing with that is you might think, well, that's a very hard thing to find out. But pick something like the 143rd number in a phone book. It just occurred to me, you probably don't even know what phone books are. That's why I've just revealed my age. We used to be, it wasn't that long ago, you had phone books, but yeah, anyway. But trust me, there was such a thing. It used to be delivered to houses, it's incredible. But you can imagine someone who thinks, well, I really care about true beliefs, so I really want to know what the 143rd number in the phone book is. But that would be crazy. No, so what, right? Unless there's some reason to know that, it's just pointless. So they're practically irrelevant, but, and I'll come back to this, it's also the case that you reveal, like, even if you really care about the truth, you don't reveal you're caring about the truth by finding out these things, right? Because they're pointless. In fact, you reveal the fact you care about the truth by not finding out those things and finding out other things instead. You know, someone who spends their time counting blades of grass is not someone who cares about the truth. You know, someone who cares about the truth is someone who signs up for, comes up to an undergraduate philosophy society talk, or they devote their life to a lab or whatever. Okay. Now pick one of these pointless truths. None of, how many spoons there are in the third drawer along in the room next door. Something none of us know, none of us have a true belief in. Are we ignorant of it? On the standard views you are. I want to suggest to you that just seems to me completely wrong. Particularly since we manifest our intellectual virtues, our concern for truth, precisely, the fact that we are good inquirers, people who care about the truth, precisely by not caring about that proposition concerning the drawer next door. So that's the first kind of case, pointless truths. We don't know them, we don't truly believe them, but it seems we're quite right not to know them. We're quite right not to truly believe them. We're not ignorant thereby. Second case, significant now, but practically undiscoverable truths. So I'm stipulating the truths are significant. They're things that it would be interesting to know if we care about the truth. But which, let's all grant, there's something we're not going to know. I picked an example because it's one that used to be used by philosophers in another regard, Caesar's breakfast, right? So the day he crosses the Rubicon. Really interesting to know what Caesar ate the day he crossed the Rubicon. I mean, this would be historically interesting. And whatever it is, it's interesting. If he eats the same thing he always does, that's interesting. What a cool guy. Or if he eats a feast, gosh, maybe this is like, maybe he knows this could be one of his final days on earth, Or maybe he doesn't eat anything, he's nervous, This would be, if you're a historian, you'd be very interested to know what Caesar had for breakfast on the day he crossed the Rubicon. Let's just grant, we don't know, and we're not going to know that. Time machines, all that kind of stuff, that's all excluded. So, it's something that's practically undiscoverable. It's not like an impossible thing to know. Maybe it doesn't contravene, as people know, it doesn't contravene physical law. It doesn't contravene logic anyway to go back in time and view these things. But practically speaking, we're not going to get to find it out. So here's the question then. Truths of this kind are inevitably of a sort that we don't know them, we don't have true beliefs. Are we ignorant of them? To my ear, that sounds very odd. Here's one way of thinking about the oddity of it. Imagine someone recognizing they can't know such a thing, they can't have a rational belief about what Caesar represents, they just have a guess. And it turns out to be true. Did they thereby remove their ignorance? That seems like an odd thing to say. And indeed, part of the reason why it sounds odd, it seems to me, is because we don't even think of this as being in the domain of ignorance in the first place. Okay, third kind of case. So as you see, we're getting stronger in terms of the structure of the case. Because now I want to say, consider structurally unknowable or unbelievable truths, if there could be such a thing. Examples are a bit harder to come by, or at least, well, they're not hard to come by. Examples that aren't contentious are hard to come by. So one example I've given here is quantum physics. This seems to put certain structural limitations on our cognition. So we can't know we can't have precise knowledge of both the current position and momentum of particle, right? Because observing the one, we affect the other. So if that's right, then there are certain structural, cognitive limitations imposed upon us. So that might be one kind of case. Other kinds of cases are more philosophical. Let me give you one. There's actually lots of this kind, but I'll mention one because it's just something that interests me. Wittgenstein, in his final work, his final notebooks, publishes Uncertainty, he talks about a class of commitments that we have. He calls them hinge commitments, or hinge propositions, or something called. They're the kinds of things that they're kind of like our base level commitments. He argues that they have to be in place in order for us to be rational subjects at all. They are the kinds of things that enable rationality to occur. They're the kinds of things that enable rational evaluation to occur. Something to be a good reason for something else, someone to believe things, to doubt things, and so forth. Here's the twist. He says it's because they play that role, they cannot themselves be rationally evaluated. So these basic commitments that we all have, we're fated to have, they can't be themselves known. Right? They can't be rationally valuable themselves. We rationally evaluate other things by having them. So we can't rationally evaluate them. They're the hinges on which rational evaluation turns. If that's right, then what Wittgenstein is saying, it doesn't matter for our purposes whether it is right. It's possible. Right? So it's a way of articulating an idea. And the idea is, could there be things that are structurally unknowable? If Wittgenstein's right, yes, there are. There's the hinge commitments. They're the kinds of things you can never know. They have to be in place. You can't know them. Here's the question, are we ignorant of them? That seems like a very strange claim. I mean, if we take seriously that the limitation here is structural, then although it's true that we don't know them, and we don't have, I was going to say we don't have true beliefs, that's a further step actually. Depends on whether you think we can have beliefs in them. I think Wittgenstein thought you can't have beliefs in them either, it's a different kind of propositional attitude. But in any case, let's stick to the knowledge claim. We certainly can't know them. If that's a structural limitation on us, it seems odd to think of that as ignorance. We're not ignorant of them, we just don't know them. They're neither known nor unknown. They're not the kinds of things that are in the market for knowledge. So therefore, they don't seem the kind of things that are in the market for ignorance either. Other kinds of cases are of this form, I think. Again, perhaps even more controversial. Excuse me. So, I mean, Marx famously talked about false consciousness, for example. He thought that there were it was in the nature, the structural nature of the economic relations that people existed in a capitalist society. There's such that the proletariat, there were certain truths they could not recognize. It's just unavailable to them. They were forever hidden from them. Or at the very least, it would require certain kinds of efforts on people's part to remove those obstacles. But at the very least, it's like a sort of standing structural bar to a certain kind of knowledge. And this is false consciousness, right? That might be another example. A structural limitation of what it is that we can know. It's interesting, I was looking back at this today, there's no temptation in the literature of people who talk about that to refer to the people who are so structurally limited as ignorant. I don't think that's an accident. Because if you're thinking of this as a structural bar to what it is they can know, then it's odd to think of it as ignorant. The social cases, though, are a bit more controversial because, fast forward to the present day, so that Marx obviously going back a bit, some people do talk about this sort of social conditions preventing knowledge in terms of ignorance. So that might be like a further question, right? To what extent do we think of it as ignorance? But it seems to me that insofar as we do think of social structures as limiting what you could know, such that, this is structural. It isn't just like, it's not like just lack of care or concern or something like that on one's part, but it's just structurally unavailable to you. Then I think the temptation to describe ignorance is diminished. Now the third kind of case is the most interesting for our purposes, right? Because if you take the standard accounts right, then this cases where you cannot have knowledge or true belief, the structural reasons, they ought to be paradigmatic cases of ignorance. Yeah? I mean, they should be absolutely clear-cut. And yet it seems to me the opposite is the case. The fact that there is this structural limitation makes it so that we're less inclined to think of it as ignorant. We should be more inclined. Okay, so what's going on in these cases? So what I've been suggesting is we've got three kinds of cases of ascending strength, as it were, where in each case what you've got is an absence of true belief, an absence of knowledge, but where I don't think we have any temptation to ascribe ignorance. And then the question then is, if that's right, what's the diagnosis? How do we explain that fact? What's missing from those accounts? Here's my proposal. I think what standard accounts of ignorance, where they've gone wrong is they focused simply on the epistemic lack. So they've said, like, ignorance involves an epistemic lack, and that's certainly true. Of course it does. There's an epistemic absence of some kind that marks out the ignorant, but it's not just that. There's a further dimension to this, and it concerns culpability. Ignorance has a normative dimension to it. It isn't just the absence of a certain epistemic standing. You have to have a certain kind of culpability for that absence. What kind of culpability, though? Because there's lots of ways we can be culpable. So I want to make a concrete proposal here. I want to suggest that the kind of culpability is an intellectual failing of the subject as an inquirer. So notice, an intellectual failure, not just a failing. We can fail in lots of different ways, but we fail intellectually. And we fail as inquirers. So let's go through the easiest way to explain what I mean by this is just to go through the cases and say how they're illustrated. So let's go in reverse order. If structurally there are certain things that can't be known, can't be believed, truly believed, well then obviously it can't be any failing of you as an inquirer that you fail to know them or truly believe them. I mean, that would be the whole moral, take the Wittgenstein and the Hinge commitment claim. You know, and I said, well, we don't know these things, they're not in the market for knowledge. If they're not in the market for knowledge, then it cannot be a failing on my part that I fail to know them. Right? So there can't be any culpability there. You know, the culpability is very clear there because there's no there can't be any culpability, right? Insofar as an intellectual ought implies an intellectual can. Right? I'm not in they're not in the market for such things as knowledge or true belief, so they can't be the kinds of things that I can culpably fail to know or fail to truly believe. What goes for that case, or I think goes in a clear-cut way for that case, will go as well for the cases where we have significant but practically undiscoverable truths. Notice now we're getting closer to the thought that it's an intellectual failing of an inquirer. You know, like in the Caesar's breakfast case, we could imagine someone undertaking an inquiry, right? The historian, they know. Imagine someone proposing as a PhD thesis, I'm going to find out what Caesar has for breakfast. You know, they know full well there's no practical way of discovering this. But they set out, this is what my PhD project is going to be. Find out what Caesar has for breakfast. Clearly, what they're doing in trying to find out such a thing, that would be a failing of an inquirer. Right? That's a bad inquiry to undertake. It's a terrible inquiry to undertake because it's doomed to failure. In contrast, in not inquiring in these things, in recognizing that they're practically undiscoverable, one manifests one's goodness as an inquirer. Hence, you know, although one doesn't know these things, one isn't manifesting any culpability as an inquirer. Right? Failing to know. Quite the opposite. You're manifesting your virtue in not knowing these things. The kinds of things, if you're a good historian, you ought not to know. And you should be fine about not knowing. And then again, think about the pointless truths. You don't know them. This doesn't manifest any failing on your part. Quite the opposite. Were you to try to find these things, were you to devote your life to finding out things like how many spoons there are in a particular cupboard, if that's what you devote your life to, that would be to manifest a failing as an inquirer. So you don't manifest any culpability as an inquirer by not knowing these things. It's quite the opposite. You'd manifest a failing by trying to find out these things. So what we've got there is some conception of what is it we have in mind, some basic conception of what it is as inquirers that we ought to be seeking, which gives us some sense of cases where we're culpable. And what we've got in the cases that I've given is, I would say, pretty clear-cut cases where there could be no culpability. However we understand that culpability, there can't be culpability of that kind. An intellectual culpability is required. Notice another thing that's going on here as well. I said before that on standard accounts, they'd have to restrict the view to ignorance seems to apply to inanimate objects and falsehood, so they'd have to make these restrictions, which on the face of it look arbitrary. On this view now, we have a principal basis for that restriction. What we're interested in, ignorance is now, as it were, tied to the notion of a good inquiry, and therefore to inquirers. So of course ignorance doesn't apply to inanimate objects and so forth, because they're not inquirers. They don't make inquiries. Relatedly, ignorance doesn't apply to falsehoods, because ignorance, inquiries aren't geared towards discovering falsehoods. There's no such thing as an inquiry geared towards discovering a falsehood. I mean, except in the unusual sense of a truth about a falsehood, but it's not geared towards the falsehood, qua falsehood. So we have a principled reason for why that restriction is in play. Why we don't talk about ignorance regarding, we don't say that tectonic plates are ignorant, and we don't say that we're ignorant of falsehoods. Because they're not the kinds of things that are relevant when it comes to evaluating inquiries. Okay, so what follows from this? So, first thought you might have is, does this account of ignorance, does it relate to what some people call pragmatic encroachment? So here's what pragmatic encroachment is. So some people think, some epistemologists think, that non-epistemic factors can have a bearing on whether or not you count as knowing. In particular, practical factors can have a bearing. So the famous cases are, if you really care about something, it's really important to you that it's right, you're right about something, and that makes it harder for you to know. Whereas you don't care much about it, it is easy to know. A famous example of this, which actually again might not make much sense to you, because it's someone trying to cash a check. Yeah, I don't know, we don't use checks, do we, anymore? But someone needs to cash a check. If it really matters that the bank is open, for that check to clear, maybe you'll lose your house if it's a mortgage payment. You've got to check, the bank better be open, otherwise the check's not going to clear. Then it may be really important to you that your belief about the bank's opening hours are correct. Imagine now another person for whom they're cashing the check, but nothing hangs upon it. The thought maybe, well, nothing, their practical interests are very low as regards to. So the very same proposition, and you might say the very same epistemic standing they've got to all, same evidence or what have you. But in one case you might say it's not enough for knowledge because it really matters that they're right. In the other case, it's not enough for knowledge. Sorry, it is enough for knowledge because it doesn't matter that they're right. So whether it matters has a bearing on how hard or easy it is to know. And various people have argued for that. I think that view's crazy, by the way, but I'm not going to argue against it. But it is a view. And one thought you might have is, well, do we have a kind of pragmatic encroachment now about ignorance if we tie it to inquiry? Because after all, inquiries are often governed by practical concerns. The kinds of things I happen to care about determines the kind of inquiries that I make. So does that mean that the extent to which I'm ignorant depends upon the things that I happen to care about? Conversely, does it mean that I can be, as it were, insulated from ignorance, the charge of ignorance, by just happening not to care about stuff? Well, that would be the kind of pragmatic encroachment claim. I don't think that follows. Obviously, if you're fine with pragmatic encroachment, then you won't care that it follows, but I don't think it follows anyway. But notice, we're talking about an intellectual failing as an inquirer, not just a failing as an inquirer. So, I mean, think about the, let's go back to those pointless truths, right? Like the number of spoons in the cupboard next door. What's relevant here, it's not just that I happen not to care about this. It's true, I don't care about it. But what's important about that case is that I ought not to care about it. It's not the kind of thing But if you care about truth, you ought to care about it. So even if we restrict ourselves to a concern with truth, still you shouldn't care about that. So it's not, as it were, that just because something doesn't interest you, you're insulated from being ignorant of it. Because what matters here is that you ought not to be interested in that. No. Even from a purely intellectual view, you shouldn't care about stuff like that. Truth seekers don't care about that kind of stuff. They don't care about the trivial stuff. They don't sweat the trivial stuff. They go for the big, meaty, significant truths. To hell with the insignificant one. So if that's right, well, you don't get a straightforward route to pragmatic encroachment. What you might get, though, which is kind of the vicinity of that thought, is a kind of relativity of ignorance. Although, again, I don't think this is really problematic. What do I mean by relativity? Well, what I mean is that to some extent it matters. As it were, your cognitive position has a bearing on the extent to which you count as ignorant. Because it has a bearing on the extent to which you can exhibit an intellectual failure as an inquirer. So I don't think it makes sense to say of a small child, let's say a newborn baby, let's say, that it's ignorant of quantum physics. It doesn't know anything about quantum physics. It has only true beliefs about quantum physics. But to say that it's ignorant, or indeed any small child, I think the word ignorance just isn't applicable there. On my view, there's an explanation for this, because I think what you haven't got there is a culpability as an inquirer. And because what that means, in effect, we're relativizing that kind of culpability, I think we do with culpability, to their, as it were, intellectual opportunities. The baby's just not in a position to know things about quantum physics. That's why it's not culpable. Of course, once you go down that route, then you'll end up saying some other kinds of things which don't concern babies. I mean, you'll say, was Aristotle ignorant of modern genetics? I'm inclined to think not, right? I mean, there is no knowledge base available to him to find out such a thing. I mean, Aristotle's probably one of the smartest people that ever lived, but it's no good unless you've got the data. I mean, there's no cognitive route for Aristotle to find out these things that we can find out. And much else besides, right? So, if we take this view of ignorance seriously, then it's tied to a notion of culpability, and that's going to have some degree of relativity built into it. But I don't think that's a troubling kind of relativity. I think actually it's a good kind of relativity. We want to have some conception of how, well, indeed, I think we want to explain a practice. As I say, I don't think we do ascribe ignorance to small children. I think we've just seen, by the way, here's a related way of putting the thought I'm trying to get at. When I say it's culpability, to say that someone's ignorant is to do more than just to say they don't know something, or they lack a true belief in something. It's to impugn them intellectually in some way. Right? You're doing more than just saying you don't know. And that's why it's not applicable to say, if you start having to go at Aristotle, basically having to go at Aristotle for not knowing these things. That doesn't seem right. How could he have known such a thing? You're having a go at the baby for not knowing these things. It doesn't seem right. How could he have known such a thing? Okay, I'm nearly done. Just a couple of minutes. Let me just bring it all back to the stuff I said at the beginning. The stuff I said at the beginning might seem very grand and obtuse, but hopefully now we can sort of see how this all fits in. Because in a nutshell, here's what I'm saying. Standard accounts of ignorance, they go awry precisely because they try to give an account of ignorance in isolation. They try to say, well, let's just have a theory about whatever the epistemic lack is that it manifests ignorance. You can't do that. Rather, you've got to embed that account of the epistemic lack, whatever it is, this epistemic absence, in terms of a wider view about intellectual ethics and epistemic axiology. Where you're going to say, what is it we're trying to seek as inquirers? What is it we care about fundamentally as epistemologists? Only with that in play can you then give your account of ignorance, because you've got to say something about, well, what kind of culpability is in play? Well, it's going to be a culpability, as I say, an intellectual culpability of inquirers. What is it that inquirers aim for? Well, presumably the fundamental epistemic good. So now we've got an account of what the fundamental epistemic good is. But now everything's tying up, just as I said it should do. Our account of intellectual ethics, what we're striving towards as inquirers, our account of the fundamental epistemic good, and therefore our account of the fundamental epistemic ill, i.e. ignorance. They all go hand in hand. You can't try and carve off one and try and analyse it independently of the others. So, just briefly, let me just explain how this plans out in particular cases. We could contrast between ignorance of versus ignorance about. So this is, take the second law of thermodynamics. Presumably, everyone here is aware that such a thing exists. So in that sense, you're not ignorant of it. But I take it most of us are ignorant about it, right? You know, we couldn't say what it is, right? We couldn't give us an explanation of it. So that's the second kind there. If that's propositional ignorance, right? It's the ignorance about that we're interested in. But there is this other kind, ignorance of, a kind of acquaintance sort of relation that's in play there. And that's a different sort of thing. And in the literature, people talk about other kinds of ignorance. I mean, I'm not going to say too much about this, but some people talk about sort of social structures as generating ignorance, whereas sometimes they seem to mean that to mean something other than propositional ignorance. I might say a little bit about this as we go along, but for our purposes, we're focusing on propositional ignorance, right? Because that's what the standard accounts are focusing on. And that just seems to be like a core notion of ignorance, right? It's ignorance about such and such. Two other bits of ground clearing, which most people don't do, but as we'll see, they're kind of important. Notice our standard accounts, they're both absence accounts, right? They're saying ignorance is, and then they're giving you the absence of something. Structurally speaking, absence accounts have a worry, which is they tend to be very broad in their reach. I mean, there are all kinds of things, like that chair, tectonic plates, the planet Venus, and so forth, that lack knowledge that P, and lack true beliefs that P, if you're going to P you like, right? I mean, they're very easy for something to satisfy that condition, the absence condition. But we don't tend to ascribe ignorance to tables and chairs and tectonic plates and so forth, and planets. Right? So that doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that ignorance is applicable to. But the absence claim would apply just as much to them. A related issue here is falsehoods. I mean, everybody lacks knowledge of falsehoods, because you can't know a falsehood. Everybody lacks true beliefs. Pick any falsehood you like. We all lack true beliefs in it, and we all lack knowledge of it. You can't have a true belief in a falsehood. You can't have knowledge of a falsehood. And yet, on both those views, it seems at the face of it, we would be thereby ignorant of them. Now, people don't, I mean, generally people in this debate don't discuss those issues at all. I think they just think, well, it's kind of obvious that we should restrict the view in some way to exclude those cases. And indeed, you can see what the restriction would be. So in the first case, you restrict it. You say, well, look, ignorance only applies to believers or knowers. It doesn't apply to things that aren't. It doesn't apply to tectonic plates, because they're not believers or knowers. In the second case, you say, well, ignorance only applies to truths. It doesn't apply to falsehoods. But it's an interesting question. Where does that restriction come from? What's the principal basis for that restriction? And the reason why I mention it is because I think what I'm going to say later on will give us a principal basis for restriction. Whereas now it's kind of ad hoc. We're just sort of throwing it out there as a way of getting rid of the problem. Okay, so why do I think the standard accounts are wrong? I want to give you three cases. I could give you more, but I just want to focus on three to keep it simple. And they're kind of in ascending order, as you'll see, in terms of the kind of problem they pose. So I want to start off with pointless truths. There are all kinds of things which we could easily know or have true beliefs in, which we don't. And we don't because, well, partly because we don't care, but also because we're, more importantly for our purposes, because we're quite right not to care. They're not of interest. So pick your favorite example of pointless truth. You know, how many blades of grass there are on the outside? How many spoons there are in the third drawer to the left in the room next door? How many pairs of socks I've got? You know, whatever you like. Just pick a pointless truth. Don't be misled, by the way. Some of these things are practically hard to discover, right? So a lot of people talk about blades of grass or grains of sand. And of course, the thing with that is You might think, well, that's a very hard thing to find out. But pick something like the 143rd number in a phone book. That just occurred to me, you probably don't even know what phone books are, that's why I've just revealed my age. Well, it used to be, it wasn't that long ago, you had phone books, but yeah, anyway, but trust me, there was such a thing. It used to be delivered to houses, it's incredible. But you can imagine someone who thinks, well, I really care about true beliefs, so I really want to know what the 143rd number in the phone book is. But that would be crazy. Well, there's no, so what, right? Unless there's some reason to know that, it's just pointless. So they're practically irrelevant, but, and I'll come back to this, it's also the case that you reveal, like, even if you really care about the truth, you don't reveal you're caring about the truth by finding out these things, right? Because they're pointless. In fact, you reveal the fact you care about the truth by not finding out those things and finding out other things instead. You know, someone who spends their time counting blades of grass is not someone who cares about the truth. You know, someone who cares about the truth is someone who signs up for, comes along to an undergraduate philosophy society talk, or they devote their life to the lab, or whatever. Okay. Now pick one of these pointless truths. None of, how many spoons there are in the third drawer along in the room next door. Something none of us know, none of us have a true belief in. Are we ignorant of it? On the standard views you are. I want to suggest to you that just seems to me completely wrong. Particularly since we manifest our intellectual virtues, our concern for the truth, precisely, the fact that we are good inquirers, people who care about the truth, precisely by not caring about that proposition concerning the drawer next door. So that's the first kind of case, pointless truths. We don't know them, we don't truly believe them, but it seems we're quite right not to know them, we're quite right not to truly believe them. We're not ignorant thereby. Second case, significant now, but practically undiscoverable truths. So I'm stipulating the truths are significant. They're things that it would be interesting to know if we care about the truth. But which, let's all grant, there's something we're not going to know. Right? I picked an example because it's the one that used to be used by philosophers in another regard, Caesar's breakfast. Right? So the day he crosses the Rubicon. Really interesting to know what Caesar ate the day he crossed the Rubicon. I mean, this would be historically interesting. I mean, whatever it is, it's interesting. If he eats the same thing he always does, that's interesting. What a cool guy. Or if he eats a feast, gosh, maybe this is like, maybe he knows this could be one of his final days on earth, Or maybe he doesn't eat anything, he's nervous, This would be, if you're a historian, you'd be very interested to know what Caesar had for breakfast on the day he crossed the Rubicon. Let's just grant, we don't know, and we're not going to know that. Time machines, all that kind of stuff, that's all excluded. So, it's something that's practically undiscoverable. It's not like an impossible thing to know. Maybe it doesn't contravene, as people know, it doesn't contravene physical law. It doesn't contravene logic anyway to go back in time and view these things. But practically speaking, we're not going to get to find it out. So here's the question then. Truths of this kind are inevitably of a sort that we don't know them, we don't have true beliefs in. Are we ignorant of them? To my ear, that sounds very odd. And here's one way of thinking about the oddity of it. Imagine someone recognizing they can't know such a thing, they can't have a rational belief about what Caesar had for breakfast, they just have a guess. And it turns out to be true. Did they thereby remove their ignorance? That seems like an odd thing to say. And indeed, part of the reason why it sounds odd, it seems to me, is because we don't even think of this as being in the domain of ignorance in the first place. Okay, third kind of case. So as you see, we're getting stronger in terms of the structure of the case. Because now I want to say, consider structurally unknowable or unbelievable truths, if there could be such a thing. Examples are a bit harder to come by, or at least, well, they're not hard to come by. Examples that aren't contentious are hard to come by. So one example I've given here is quantum physics. This seems to put certain structural limitations on our cognition. So we can't know the precise, we can't have precise knowledge of both the current position and momentum of the particle, right? Because observing the one, we affect the other. So if that's right, then there are certain structural, cognitive limitations imposed upon us. So that might be one kind of case. Other kinds of cases are more philosophical. Let me give you one. There's actually lots of this kind, but I'll mention one because it's just something that interests me. Wittgenstein, in his final work, his final notebooks, publishes Uncertainty, he talks about a class of commitments that we have. He calls them hinge commitments or hinge propositions or something cool. They're the kinds of things that they're kind of like our base level commitments. He argues that they have to be in place in order for us to be rational subjects at all. They are the kinds of things that enable rationality to occur. They're the kinds of things that enable rational evaluation to occur. For something to be a good reason for something else, someone to believe things, to doubt things, and so forth. Here's the twist. He says it's because they play that role, they cannot themselves be rationally evaluated. So these basic commitments that we all have, we're fated to have, they can't be themselves known. Right? They can't be rationally valuable themselves. We rationally evaluate other things by having them. So we can't rationally evaluate them. They're the hinges on which rational evaluation turns. If that's right, then what Wittgenstein is saying, it doesn't matter for our purposes whether it is right. It's possible, right? So it's a way of articulating an idea. And the idea is, could there be things that are structurally unknowable? If Wittgenstein's right, yes, there are. There's the hinge commitments. They're the kinds of things you can never know. They have to be in place. You can't know them. Here's the question, are we ignorant of them? That seems like a very strange claim. I mean, if we take seriously that the limitation here is structural, then although it's true that we don't know them, and we don't have, we don't have true beliefs, that's a further step actually. Depends on whether you think we can have beliefs in them. I think Wittgenstein thought you can't have beliefs in them either. It's a different kind of propositional attitude. But in any case, let's stick to the knowledge claim. We certainly can't know them. If that's a structural limitation on us, it seems odd to think of that as ignorance. Not ignorant of them, we just don't know them. They're neither known nor unknown. They're not the kinds of things that are in the market for knowledge. So therefore, they don't seem the kind of things that are in the market for ignorance either. Other kinds of cases are of this form, I think. Again, perhaps even more controversial. Excuse me. So, I mean, Marx famously talked about false consciousness, for example. He thought that there were it was in the nature, the structural nature of the economic relations that people existed in a capitalist society. It was such that the proletariat, there were certain truths they could not recognize. It's just unavailable to them. They were forever hidden from them. Or at the very least, it would require certain kinds of efforts on people's part to remove those obstacles. But at the very least, it's like a sort of standing structural bar to a certain kind of knowledge. And this is false consciousness, right? That might be another example. A structural limitation of what it is that we can know. It's interesting, I was looking back at this today, there's no temptation in the literature of people who talk about that to refer to the people who are so structurally limited as ignorant. I don't think that's an accident. Because if you're thinking of this as a structural bar to what it is they can know, then it's odd to think of it as ignorance. The social cases are a bit more controversial because fast forward to the present day, so that Marx obviously was going back a bit. Some people do talk about the sort of social conditions preventing knowledge in terms of ignorance. So that might be like a further question, right? To what extent do we think of it as ignorance? But it seems to me that insofar as we do think of social structures as limiting what you can know, such that, you know, this is structural. It isn't just like, it's not like just lack of care or concern or something like that on one's part, but it's just structurally unavailable to you. Then I think the temptation to describe ignorance is diminished. Now the third kind of case is the most interesting for our purposes, right? Because if you take the standard accounts right, then this cases where you cannot have knowledge or true belief, the structural reasons, they ought to be paradigmatic cases of ignorance. Yeah? I mean, they should be absolutely clear-cut. And yet it seems to me the opposite is the case. The fact that there is this structural limitation makes it so that we're less inclined to think of it as ignorant. We should be more inclined. Okay, so what's going on in these cases? So what I've been suggesting is we've got three kinds of cases of ascending strength, as it were, where in each case what you've got is an absence of true belief, an absence of knowledge, but where I don't think we have any temptation to describe ignorance. And then the question is, if that's right, what's the diagnosis? How do we explain that fact? What's missing from those accounts? Here's my proposal. I think what standard accounts of ignorance, where they've gone wrong is they focused simply on the epistemic lack. So they've said, like, ignorance involves an epistemic lack, and that's certainly true. Of course it does. There's an epistemic absence of some kind that marks out the ignorance, but it's not just that. There's a further dimension to this, and it concerns culpability. Ignorance has a normative dimension to it. It isn't just the absence of a certain epistemic standing. You have to have a certain kind of culpability for that absence. What kind of culpability, though? Because there's lots of ways we can be culpable. So I want to make a concrete proposal here. I want to suggest that the kind of culpability is an intellectual failing of the subject as an inquirer. So notice, an intellectual failure, not just a failing, we can fail in lots of different ways, but we fail intellectually. And we fail as inquirers. So let's go through the easiest way to explain what I mean by this is just to go through the cases and say how we illustrate it. So let's go in reverse order. If structurally there are certain things that can't be known and can't be believed, truly believed, well then obviously it can't be any failing of you as an inquirer that you fail to know them or truly believe them. I mean, that would be the whole moral. Take the Wittgenstein and the Hinge commitments claim. You know, and I said, well, we don't know these things, they're in the market for knowledge. If they're not in the market for knowledge, then it cannot be a failing on my part that I fail to know them. Right? So there can't be any culpability there. You know, the culpability is very clear there because there's no there can't be any culpability, right? Insofar as an intellectual ought implies an intellectual can. Right? I'm not in they're not in the market for such things as knowledge as true or true beliefs. They can't be the kinds of things that I can culpably fail to know or fail to truly believe. What goes for that case, or what I think goes in a clear-cut way for that case, will go as well for the cases where we have significant but practically undiscoverable truths. Notice now we're getting closer to the thought that it's an intellectual failing of an inquirer. You know, in the Caesar's breakfast case, we could imagine someone undertaking an inquiry, right? The historian, they imagine someone proposing as a PhD thesis, I'm going to find out what Caesar has for breakfast. You know, they know full well there's no practical way of discovering this, but they set out, this is what my PhD project is going to be, finding out what Caesar has for breakfast. Clearly, what they're doing in trying to find out such a thing, that would be a failing of an inquirer, right? That's a bad inquiry to undertake. It's a terrible inquiry to undertake because it's doomed to failure. In contrast, in not inquiring in these things, in recognizing that they're practically undiscoverable, one manifests one's goodness as an inquirer. Hence, you know, although one doesn't know these things, one isn't manifesting any culpability as an inquirer. Right? Failing to know. Quite the opposite. You're manifesting your virtue in not knowing these things. The kinds of things, if you're a good historian, you ought not to know. And you should be glad, you should be fine about not knowing. And then again, think about the pointless truths. You don't know them. This doesn't manifest any failing on your part, quite the opposite. Were you to try to find these things, were you to devote your life to finding out things like how many spoons there are in a particular cupboard, if that's what you devote your life to, that would be to manifest a failing as an inquirer. So you don't manifest any culpability as an inquirer by not knowing these things. It's quite the opposite. You'd manifest a failing by trying to find out these things. So what we've got there is some conception of, well, what is it? We have in mind some basic conception of what it is as inquirers that we ought to be seeking, which gives us some sense of cases where we're culpable. And what we've got in the cases that I've given is, I would say, pretty clear-cut cases where there could be no culpability. However we understand that culpability, there can't be culpability of that kind. An intellectual culpability is required. Notice another thing that's going on here as well. I said before that on standard accounts, they'd have to restrict the view to, ignorance seems to apply to inanimate objects, to falsehoods, so they'd have to make these restrictions, which on the face of it look arbitrary. On this view now, we have a principal basis for that restriction. What we're interested in, ignorance is now, as it were, tied to the notion of good inquiry, and therefore to inquirers. So of course ignorance doesn't apply to inanimate objects and so forth, because they're not inquirers, they don't make inquiries. Relatedly, ignorance doesn't apply to falsehoods, because inquiries aren't geared towards discovering falsehoods. There's no such thing as an inquiry geared towards discovering the falsehood. I mean, except in the unusual sense of a truth about a falsehood, but it's not geared towards the falsehood, qua falsehood. Right? So we have a principled reason for why that restriction is in play. Why we don't talk about ignorance regarding, we don't say that tectonic plates are ignorant, and we don't say that we're ignorant of falsehoods, because they're not the kinds of things that are relevant when it comes to evaluating inquirers. Okay, so what follows from this? So, first thought you might have is, does this account of ignorance, does it relate to what some people call pragmatic encroachment? So here's what pragmatic encroachment is. So some people think, some epistemologists think, that non-epistemic factors can have a bearing on whether or not you count as knowing. In particular, practical factors can have a bearing. So the famous cases are, if you really care about something, it's really important to you that it's right, you're right about something, and that makes it harder for you to know. Whereas if you don't care much about it, it's easy to know. A famous example of this, which actually again might not make much sense to you, because it's someone trying to cash a check. Okay, I don't know, we don't use checks, do we, anymore? But someone needs to cash a check. If it really matters that the bank is open, for that check to clear, maybe you'll lose your house if it's a mortgage payment. But if that check, the bank had better be open, otherwise the check's not going to clear. Then it may be really important to you that your belief about the bank's opening hours are correct. Imagine now another person for whom they're cashing the check, but nothing hangs upon it. The thought may be, well, nothing, their practical interests are very low as regards this. So the very same proposition, and they might say the very same epistemic standing they've got to all, same evidence or what have you. But in one case you might say it's not enough for knowledge because it really matters that they're right. In the other case, it's not enough for knowledge. It is enough for knowledge because it doesn't matter that they're right. So whether it matters has a bearing on how hard or easy it is to know. And various people have argued for that. I think that view's crazy, by the way, but I'm not going to argue against it. But it is a view. And one thought you might have is, well, do we have a kind of pragmatic encroachment now about ignorance if we tie it to inquiry? Because after all, inquiries are often governed by practical concerns. The kinds of things I happen to care about determines the kind of inquiries that I make. So does that mean that the extent to which I'm ignorant depends upon the things that I happen to care about? Conversely, does it mean that I can be, as it were, insulated from ignorance, the charge of ignorance, by just happening not to care about stuff? Well, that'll be the kind of pragmatic encroachment claim. I don't think that follows. Obviously, if you're fine with pragmatic encroachment, then you won't care that it follows, but I don't think it follows anyway. So notice, we're talking about an intellectual failing as an inquirer, not just a failing as an inquirer. So, think about let's go back to those pointless truths, right? Like the number of spoons in the cupboard next door. What's relevant here, it's not just that I happen not to care about this. It's true, I don't care about it. But what's important about that case is that I ought not to care about it. Right? It's not the kind of thing But if you care about truth, you ought to care about it. So even if we restrict ourselves to a concern with truth, still you shouldn't care about that. So it's not, as it were, that just because something doesn't interest you, you're insulated from being ignorant from it. Because what matters here is that you ought not to be interested in that. Even from a purely intellectual view, you shouldn't care about stuff like that. Truth seekers don't care about that kind of stuff. They don't care about the trivial stuff. They don't sweat the trivial stuff. They go for the big, meaty, significant truths. To hell with the insignificant ones. So if that's right, well, you don't get a straightforward route to pragmatic encroachment here. What you might get, though, which is kind of the vicinity of that thought, is a kind of relativity of ignorance. Although, again, I don't think this is really problematic. What do I mean by relativity? Well, what I mean is that to some extent it matters, as it were, your cognitive position has a bearing on the extent to which you count as ignorant. Because it has a bearing on the extent to which you can exhibit an intellectual failure as an inquirer. So I don't think it makes sense to say of a small child, let's say a newborn baby, let's say, that it's ignorant of quantum physics. It doesn't know anything about quantum physics, it's only true beliefs about quantum physics, but to say that it's ignorant, or indeed any small child, I think the word ignorance just isn't applicable there. On my view, there's an explanation for this, because I think what you haven't got there is a culpability as an inquirer. And of course what that means, in effect, we're relativizing that kind of culpability, I think we do with culpability, to their, as it were, intellectual opportunities. The baby's just not in a position to know things about quantum physics. That's why it's not culpable. Of course, once you go down that route, then you'll end up saying some other kinds of things which don't concern babies. I mean, you'll say, was Aristotle ignorant of modern genetics? I'm inclined to think not, right? I mean, there is no knowledge base available to her to find out such a thing. I mean, Aristotle's probably one of the smartest people that ever lived, but it's no good unless you've got the data. I mean, there's no cognitive route for Aristotle to find out these things that we can find out. And much else besides, right? So if we take this view of ignorance seriously, then it's tied to a notion of culpability, and that's going to have some degree of relativity built into it. But I don't think that's a troubling kind of relativity. I think actually it's a good kind of relativity. We want to have some conception of how, indeed, I think we want to explain a practice. As I say, I don't think we do ascribe ignorance to small children. I think it would just seem, by the way, here's another related way of putting the thought I'm trying to get at. When I say it's culpability, to say that someone's ignorant is to do more than just to say they don't know something, or that they lack a true belief in something. It's to impugn them intellectually in some way, right? You're doing more than just saying you don't know. And that's why it's not applicable to say, if you start having to go at Aristotle, basically you're having to go at Aristotle for not knowing these things. That doesn't seem right. How could he have known such a thing? You're having a go at the baby for not knowing these things. It doesn't seem right. How could he have known such a thing? Okay, I'm nearly done. Just a couple of minutes. Let me just bring it all back to the stuff I said at the beginning. The stuff I said at the beginning might have seemed very grand and obtuse, but hopefully now we can sort of see how this all fits in. Because in a nutshell, here's what I'm saying. Standard accounts of ignorance, they go awry precisely because they try to give an account of ignorance in isolation. They try to say, well, let's just have a theory about whatever the epistemic lack is that it manifests ignorance. You can't do that. Rather, you've got to embed that account of the epistemic lack, whatever it is, this epistemic absence, in terms of a wider view about intellectual ethics and epistemic axiology. Right? You've got to say, what is it we're trying to seek as inquirers? What is it we care about fundamentally as epistemologists? Only with that in play can you then give your account of ignorance, because you've got to say something about, well, what kind of culpability is in play? Well, it's going to be a culpability, as I say, an intellectual culpability of inquirers. What is it that inquirers aim for? Well, presumably the fundamental epistemic good. So now we've got an account of what the fundamental epistemic good is. But now everything's tying up, just as I said it should do. Our account of intellectual ethics, what we're striving towards as inquirers, our account of the fundamental epistemic good, and therefore our account of the fundamental epistemic ill, i.e. ignorance. They all go hand in hand. You can't try and carve off one and try and analyse it independently of the others. So, just briefly, let me just explain how this plans out in particular cases. So let's go back to the knowledge view, the knowledge account, right? So the knowledge account now, if you were to take on board what I just said, you'd have to rejig it. You'd have to say, well, ignorance isn't just a lack of knowledge. It's a lack of knowledge, plus there's this kind of intellectual culpability that I'm talking about. Moreover, you'd have to make a claim like this. You'd have to say, well, look, why is ignorance like this? It's because, well, knowledge is the fundamental epistemic good. That's what we're trying to get at. That's why and there's two ways we can lack it, as it were. One is just the mere absence, but the other is the culpability. The mere absence, then more importantly, is the culpable absence. And it's the culpable absence as inquirers. That's the one that we're really interested in now. Here's a payoff. If you have that view, notice Gettier style cases don't pose you a problem anymore. Sure, Gettier style cases you don't know, but there's no culpability there. That's the whole thing about Gettier cases. There's no failing as an inquirer in a Gettier case. That's why you're justified. So if you went down the route, if you have the knowledge account now and you take on board what I just said, then that problem disappears for you. To my enemies, I give gifts, right? Here's a gift. I don't actually hold that view, but if you do hold that view, your problems are solved. All you've got to do is take on board this other stuff that I've been saying about how you can't just simply analyse ignorance by itself. You've got to embed it within an account of epistemic axiology. But presumably anyone who holds that view, they'll be happy with that account of epistemic axiology. They'll be happy with the idea that knowledge is the fundamental epistemic good. So they'll be happy with the thought, well, knowledge is the fundamental epistemic good, ignorance is the fundamental epistemic ill. So what is ignorance then? It's culpable absence of the fundamental epistemic good. It's culpable lack of knowledge. And that's not what you've got in Gettier style cases. That's why they're not ignorance, even though they're not knowledge. But actually, you can make the same kind of move or similar sorts of moves if you go down different routes. So think about the true belief account. So the thought now would be, don't just say, if you want to pursue that line, don't just say ignorance is lack of true belief. You've got to say it's culpable. Lack of true belief then involves a certain kind of culpability. Moreover, why do you think that it has anything to do with true belief on this view? Well, it must be because you think truth is the fundamental epistemic good. So that's why you think the lack of it is ignorance. So truth is the fundamental epistemic good. Ignorance is the fundamental epistemic evil. And that means ignorance then is the absence of the fundamental epistemic good plus culpability, right, and inquiry. Now that doesn't directly help you with lucky true beliefs in the way what I said a moment ago directly helps you in Gettier style cases, but it indirectly helps you. Because once you start to think that what's motivating that view is the thought that truth is the fundamental epistemic good, well now I think you should be very suspicious of the thought that lucky true beliefs are epistemically good. I mean, sure, you've got truth. You don't have much truth though. I mean, think about what it is to care about truth. You don't just want, as it were, your beliefs just to, it's not like throwing darts. Think of beliefs as darts. You're throwing them randomly and you just hope a few of them hit the bullseye. That's not what a concern for truth is. Concern for truth is to grasp it, to have cognitive contact with reality, to latch on to the world in important respects. That's what it means to care about the truth. Lucky true beliefs aren't really that important in terms of a concern for truth. And indeed, you can see that already. To know something versus to merely true believe it. Think of a lucky guess. Knowledge is as it were, true belief embedded in lots of other true beliefs. Lucky true belief is a true belief embedded in lots of false beliefs or no beliefs at all. So if you care about truth, of course you're going to care about the former rather than the latter. But you'll care about it because you care about the truth. So already we've got a way of saying, well, what's odd about lucky true beliefs? Why do they feel like ignorance? Well, it's because they, in a sense, they're not what we're after. The fundamental epistemic good is truth, but that's not to be understood as just any old true belief. It's to be understood more concretely as a kind of a latching onto the truth, a grip on reality. And you don't get that just by having lucky true beliefs. So the thought is, once you start to embed a true belief account of ignorance into a broader account of epistemic axiology, well then you have an explanation of what's going on in these cases, why they're not as problematic as the way they seem. Just as if you have the knowledge view and you embed it with an account of epistemic axiology, you have an account of what's going on in Gettier style cases. And in fact, those two options don't exhaust the options now. After all, as I mentioned before, there are multiple accounts of epistemic axiology. You might think understanding is the fundamental epistemic good. Right? If you think that, well then now you should have an account of ignorance as the lack of understanding, a culpable lack of understanding. So we can now map out the different options. What's crucial though, and this is the point I've been trying to make, is the embedding your account of ignorance within that broader context is vital. Try and do it without that, it doesn't work. And that's basically it. I'll just throw in one more thought, and then I'm done. I think there's lots of ramifications of this idea, but I'll just chuck out one which I think is kind of fun. It's really interesting to reflect on, if there's a God, what kind of properties might God have? And some of those properties presumably will be epistemic. So one debate about God is in terms of omniscience. And of course, I'm sure you might be familiar with it, how this is going to pan out. On the one hand, if you take the properties in isolation, you think, well, God would have to be completely omniscient. But then, of course, when you take all the other properties that God's meant to have in concert with one another, perfect goodness, omnipresent, blah, blah, blah. So there's all these different properties. Of course, some of them restrict the others. So there's this problem of sort of classical theology, how to make sense of this sort of restricted omniscience that's in play. Well, here's a way of thinking about it. Maybe there are things that God doesn't know. But would it follow, on this view, it doesn't therefore follow that there's ignorance. Right? So there'd be a way of thinking that there are things that a perfect knower might fail to know, but where you wouldn't think of this as ignorance. So the relevant sense of omniscience that's applicable to a divine being would be the sense that involves no ignorance, not the sense that involves knowing all propositions. Of course, you've got to tweak a bunch of things there. If there is a God, he doesn't know, she doesn't know, whatever. Doesn't know in the sense that we know, right? Propositionally, because that involves abilities and acquisition and so on. Presumably, it's kind of an acquaintance with facts. Relatedly, God's not an inquirer, right? Because it's all there. Inquiry implies a process of acquisition, but it's just boom, it's just there. So you've got to tweak things around. But I think that might be one. In general, the thought is that we've got some conceptual distance now between lack of knowledge, lack of true belief, lack of whatever epistemic good that interests you on the one hand, and ignorance on the other. And so that's the kind of distance that you can then exploit to explain certain things elsewhere. All right, okay, thanks.
Thank you, Professor Pritchard. And in 10 minutes, we'll have our Q&A panel.
We'll be starting our Q&A panel right about now. If you guys have any questions for Professor Pritchard, feel free to raise your hand and I'll point to whoever's asking.
Come on, people. I know you have
Yes.
questions.
Who determines what truth is significant?
Yeah, good. So, good question. So, on standard views, right, that's kind of a mysterious question. Because, absent any account of what the fundamental epistemic good is, or what intellectual ethics are about, how would you tell which truth is significant, right? I mean, what I'm getting at is you need some independent handle on those questions before you can even start talking about significance. Because presumably by significance, we don't mean what people happen to find significant. Right? I mean, it could be that the things we happen to find significant are all the wrong things. So significance here is not a descriptive notion. It's got to be some kind of normative notion. It's got to be a question about the things that we ought to care about. So it's not just what we care about, things we ought to care about, things we find significant, or we ought to find significant. So in order to answer that question, we first got to have an account of, well, what is it we're trying to do, and what kind of norms govern that? What I did in the talk is I bracketed that a little bit, because what I did was I tried to pick cases where it's uncontentious. Right, so I take it as uncontentious that no one cares how many spoons are in the room next door in that drawer. But where it gets trickier is when we get to cases where there's some dispute over what's significant. Right? So, think of
Anything in the current landscape.
yeah. I don't know. I'm in the classic situation of trying to think of something both uncontroversial, but which will, if you're interested, it's almost impossible. But yeah, I mean, like political claims of a kind would do, right? But what we need, I mean, what you need to do is think it's whatever significance it is. Not just it can't just be what we happen to find significant. It's not just about us and what we happen to be interested in. It's got to be a normative claim about what we ought to find significant, and what we ought to find significant to the extent that we care about the epistemic goods. And that means you need an account of that. So if you think truth is the epistemic good, and if you think intellectual virtues are geared towards the truth, so inquiry, virtuous inquiry is about getting at the truth. Remember, as I said there, what that means isn't just amassing lots of true beliefs, it means getting to reality, getting a grip on reality, how things really are in an important way. If you think that's what it is, that's going to determine what you think is significant. Right? And that will give an explanation of why how many spoons in the cupboard doesn't count. Because that doesn't give you any grip on reality. It doesn't give you any grip on the way the world is. But it would explain why certain political truths are really important. It would explain why certain scientific truths are really important. It would explain why, for example, it's really important to know whether or not you're in the matrix. Right? Because that's about your grip on reality. These are things that, if that's what we care about, these are things we want to know.
So would you use this sort of model to know when you don't blame the baby for not knowing quantum physics?
So what's the question? So what's the model?
Sort of, is this how you, this way to tell what is significant and what is not?
Okay, good. It's more than just that. So it's partly that, right? Because what we're doing is we're evaluating the baby as an inquirer.
Yes.
And the thought is, well, has the baby failed in some way in not knowing quantum physics? And of course they haven't. So that's why ignorance isn't applicable. It's true of the baby that it fails to know and truly believe lots of things, but it doesn't thereby exhibit ignorance, because it hasn't failed as an inquirer. It gets more interesting now, there's a bunch of things right now that you could know, but maybe it'd be very difficult for you to know. Have you failed as an inquirer? Those are the kind of cases that are hardest to tell. It's more penumbral. And then if we move further out, we get to cases where it's so difficult for you to know them, I think ignorance starts to become inapplicable. Think of really bits of mathematics where, unless you've got some sort of predisposition, this kind of thing, it's just beyond most people. I think there it makes no sense to talk about ignorance, because it's not the kind of thing that we can come to know. So we couldn't exhibit a failing as an inquirer. But there's going to be penumbral ranges in between where it's going to be hard to determine. I think it might actually, in part, have to do with, to some extent, to your role in society. So I think we have expectations that our doctors, for example, they ought to be keeping abreast of certain kinds of medical development. And if they don't, they're really culpable. And that's a kind of, in a way that there may be those kind of medical developments and things that I could keep abreast of if I wanted to, but we wouldn't hold me culpable for them because I don't have any social role connected with those truths. So this is what I was saying about there's a kind of relativity there, but I think it's a sort of harmless relativity. It's an explicable one. Well, the doctors they have taken on a role, so they have incurred certain responsibilities, and that means they're intellectually culpable in ways that I might not be because I haven't taken on that role.
Harrison?
Earlier you gave the example of a PhD student trying to figure out what Caesar had for breakfast. By endeavoring to find that out, do they adopt a culpability and become ignorant they become ignorant at that point? Right?
Okay, yeah, good question. So, you could use the word. I mean, I think a better word to use there is that they're misguided or something like that. I know what you're getting at, and it's a good point, because what you're saying is, well, now it's not just that they fail to know something, but they fail to know in a kind of culpable way because they're inquiring about things they ought not to inquire about. Is that the kind of thought? Yeah. Good, but I think that's not quite the kind of culpability. Yeah, good question. So that's not quite the culpability that we have in mind, though. It's as it were, what's gone wrong there is that they've tried to inquire about things which aren't the proper object of inquiry. So there's a misguided, it's like a kind of because in a sense, they've misunderstood what historical inquiry is. I mean, what is it they're going to do as part of their PhD exactly? You know, are they going to start building a time machine? I mean, what are they going to do? I mean, insofar as they grant there's no practical way of discerning this, are they just going to sit in a room and like flip coins? It seems like this is what I mean by saying, yeah, there is a culpability there, but it's not the kind that we're talking about. It's like they haven't quite understood what an inquiry is. So it's kind of, so I would rather say that they're misguided rather than ignorant. They lack knowledge and now they're undertaking a misguided inquiry. But ignorance isn't really applicable to these kinds of truths. They're just not the sorts of things that the product of inquiry.
So like, in some sense, there's like a finite number of hours in like our day and in our lives, and we have to choose what we inquire about.
Not in some sense. In the real sense, yeah.
And we have to choose what we inquire about and what we don't. But does that necessarily mean that we are ignorant of some subjects and we are just doomed to forever be ignorant? Or does our definition of ignorance say that, okay, you chose to spend your time learning philosophy instead of history, you're ignorant? Or does that necessarily follow?
Yeah, good. I mean, this is what I mean when I said that there's a kind of relativity there, right? Because as you say, you can't know everything. I mean, I think in some respects it's kind of indexed to what you're capable of. You know, I mean, there are things which I can certainly, you know, as you say, incrementally one can always increase what one knows. And so there are lots of things which we could imagine as being, you know, if I were to stop watching Game of Thrones or whatever, I could learn French. You know, there's a kind of trade-offs that we can all imagine, and then, but as far as we can make those sense of those trade-offs, we can talk about them being ignorant. But it would be kind of crazy to say that, you know, pick some domain which is so incredibly complex and beyond your means, to say therefore you're ignorant of that. Or I think more close to what you have in mind, a domain where you'd have to stop. You'd have to put down everything else in order to devote your whole life to knowing it. I think now it starts to look tenuous to say that's ignorance, because of course in a very real sense, it isn't practically available to you. So that's what I was getting at, the kind of relativity. It's kind of, it's indexed to you and your opportunities to know it. So, you know, it makes sense to say of me that I'm ignorant of French, but am I ignorant of, you know, pick some domain which is so complex and so beyond my means? Well, now I think no. And it relates to the fact that when we say someone's ignorant, we're not just saying that we lack knowledge of them, we're implying some sort of culpability, like there's something we could reasonably have done to rectify that. And if there's nothing reasonably we could have done to rectify it, well, then ignorance doesn't seem applicable.
Danilo?
So if ignorance happens to be a relative type of matter here, then up to what level do you happen to draw the line as to what it means to act ignorantly in an ignorant matter and in a negligent matter? Since obviously we cannot know everything, as you stated before.
Yeah, okay, so you're thinking of a kind of epistemic negligence.
Correct, yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting, negligence, what it brings with it. I mean, negligence, to my ear, and this is just thinking on my feet, negligence is both a harsher term and a more narrow term. So, more narrow in the sense that it implies a very specific kind of, it almost implies something contractual. You know, so So think about the ignorance of the doctor. The doctor that doesn't keep abreast of medical developments, which presumably is in their code of conduct or whatever, it's in their training. You know, to say that not just they're ignorant but they're negligent, it seems to imply a specific kind, culpability of a very specific kind. In this case, attached to a role and certain obligations they have as part of that role. So I guess I'm inclined to think that epistemic negligence is like kind of, I'm thinking it was a subset of ignorance. Were you thinking that the two might come apart altogether?
Yes, I was thinking in the sense that, as you mentioned, negligence happens to bear some kind of guilt as to, and some kind of scenario where you act negligence, then that's kind of implying that you should have known better, therefore you don't really, or you shouldn't have had that ignorant behavior or that lack of knowledge.
Yeah, okay, good. I mean, I think that fits with what I want because, you know, ignorance is a broader category because I think, you know, there's a sense in which I am ignorant of, you know, I'm ignorant of medieval history. It's not a, I'm not negligent, right? You know, it's not like I was under some special obligation to find out. You know, if I was a professor of medieval history, then it's negligence, right? But just, you know, but one committee, I could easily find out about it, right? I've got time, I could go to the library. These are things I could find out about medieval history. But I don't. So it makes sense to talk to me as being, so ignorance is more of a generic kind of culpability. So it's like a lack of knowledge where it reveals some lack of concern on my part, you know, the fact that I'll watch TV rather than find out about that, you know, medieval history, because it's not like I think it's not important, obviously I do. But to say that it was negligent would be to imply that I'm under some special obligation to find out about it, like the doctor. And I think that's the difference. And negligence, I think, would be a subcategory. It's a epistemic intellectual negligence specifically would be a subcategory of ignorance. It's where failing to know where there's a culpability which attaches more to a specific role. I guess that's what my instinct would be. But I haven't thought about it. That's a good question. Negligence.
Monica?
Can you expand on the notion of manifesting your virtue in not knowing in regards to the unknowable truths? Because I understand more or less how you would have some kind of failure on your part as an inquirer if you're trying to figure out some of the more pointless truths, but I don't quite understand, or it's not as clear with the more significant or unbelievable truths.
Yeah, I mean, so going back to this question earlier, like if I say to myself, like, I'm going to devote my life to finding out what Caesar had for breakfast, you know, that wouldn't be to manifest my virtue intellectually. It would just be like, you know, as I say, it'd be like a misguided inquiry, right? Because I'm actually going to achieve nothing, you know, intellectually speaking. Or, you know, if I were, you know, on the Wittgensteinian thing, I take it seriously, so I think there's these hinge commitments. So I buy all that, and then I say, but still I want to find out what they are. You know, even whilst granting, there is no such thing as finding out, having reasons for them. There can be no such thing. But still, you know, I strive for reasons. Well, now it's kind of like a gear spinning that's not engaging with anything. So you manifest your intellectual virtues by you know, trying to get to the truth. I mean, I would say trying to get this cognitive engagement with reality, trying to get a grip on the way things really are. And of course, you're not doing any of that if you're doing sort of misguided inquiries, or if you're inquiring things where nothing can be known. So, as it were, what I would say is that once we start to think about what it is to manifest intellectual virtue, it isn't just simply geared at the truth, simplicity. It's geared at a particular kind of truth, you know, it's latching onto the world, that's what we want to get at. And that means there'll be certain kinds of truth which will fall by the wayside because they're pointless, because they're practically unavailable, or because they're structurally unavailable.
Yes.
I'm Miriam. I'm in the School of Nursing. I've had to do some translating of your words. I'm not a trained professional philosopher. So am I right that I took it that what we need to take into consideration is the relevance of the knowledge? Then we also need to take into account the conditions of the inquiry. You know, like, is it a baby? Is it somebody else? And then by working those two together is how we make this determination of ignorance. And in my world, I wouldn't really call it ignorance. It would be what to do, how best to act. And then culpability, that becomes more of a technical term in terms of you'd have to review the relevance of the knowledge and the conditions of inquiry and what actually was acted, how the act happened, to know, okay, was there a breakdown? You know, was there a mistake in the relevance of the knowledge, or was there a mistake in the conditions?
Yeah. Okay, good. So that's almost there. So the few things. One, remember the culpability is, and it's very important, I think, in a medical context, it's intellectual. Of course, in a medical context, there might be all kinds of ways in which you can be culpable, which aren't necessarily intellectual. So we're drilling down on that notion to you're intellectually culpable. And the thought is that when you say someone's ignorant, you're not just saying that they lack the relevant epistemic good, knowledge, truth, what have you. You're in addition saying, and there's some culpability for that lack, right, from an intellectual point of view. Right? So you as an inquirer have done something amiss, something wrong. You failed in some way. So that's kind of what you were saying in the beginning. I'm trying to think if there wasn't one difference, but it's zoomed out in my head. So what I was getting at when I was talking there is that once you start to think of it in those terms, then that means you need to explain where the culpability comes from, what frames it. And that means you've got to have some account of, well, what is inquiry aimed at from an intellectual point of view? And that's what I was talking about. Is it truth? Is it knowledge? Is it understanding? Whatever. Because that determines what a failure of inquiry is.
Well, because I wrote down ignorance is not knowing how to act based on this analysis, which is one thing, but the culpability, to me, is a different factor or element.
I mean, it bears on how to act, but I was primarily thinking at the level of, as I say, propositional ignorance, at the level of a proposition which you fail to know, fail to believe or whatever. So it's more of the level of beliefs. Of course, you manifest what you believe, what you know, and how you act. So, as it were, action is downstream from belief. It's a consequence of what you know and what you believe. So you'll get judgments about your actions as a result. But I was thinking, just even before we get to actions, even suppose no one they never act on their ignorance, so they're not culpable for their actions. They can still be culpable just for failing to know certain things. I mean, think about it in a medical context. Someone's ignorant of something. Let's say that they should. So there's something they ought to know, they don't know. Let's say whether or not a room's been sterilised or something like that. It's their job to know such a thing. They don't know it. And it's due to some failure of inquiry on their part. They just didn't bother checking, or whatever. So you've got ignorance now. It could be that this leads to no relevant action. You know, no one's made sick by it or anything like that. There's nothing. It's not like anything downstream in terms of action occurs. So there's no culpability there. Still, we can hold them account as intellectually as being ignorant of something they ought to have known, but they didn't. So that was the thought. Because where a standard view is just say it's enough that you lack the relevant epistemic good, knowledge, or true belief. I'm saying, no, it's more than that. There's a culpability as well. So ignorance has a normative dimension to it.
Don't you think that it's ignorant to call someone ignorant for inquiring something that's structurally impossible when some of the greatest things we have today we have because we inquired about things we presume to be impossible because impossible because of structure?
Yeah, good. Okay, good. So remember, we kind of stipulated the thing is structurally. So the case I was imagining is a case where they grant that it's structurally impossible, and then they inquire anyway. The case you have in mind, I think, is slightly different. That's the more interesting case, is where everyone else says it's structurally impossible, but you don't think it is, and then you inquire. Now you're doing something brave, right? Now it's something intellectually brave, intellectual courage. even there, I think there are some constraints on it. I mean, you think about intellectually brave people. So a good case of this is, well, it's not really structural. I was thinking Richard Feynman springs to mind. He was a physicist, but he was, yeah, maybe that's it's not structural. Yeah.
Be landing on the moon structural.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, I mean, so, I mean, there are all these tales about, they're not clean cases because they often have practical and epistemic elements in there. I mean, like, yeah, the moon case, I mean, the moon case and the early flight cases are often instances where, people, trains were the same, the standard view had it that trains were, if trains went beyond something like 22 miles or something, people would die of suffocation. That was the standard view. It took certain kind of mavericks to try and prove that wrong. Flight was considered impossible for a long time. So yeah, often though the reason why they're a bit trickier, they're not structural so much. They're just it's more a case of saying, well, given what we know, there's kind of like all the evidence, as it were, is against you. I mean, what's interesting about science is that it actually rewards mavericks. Whether it should or not, interesting question, but it does. In fact, it actually, if you look at the sort of social structure of science, it rewards the conservative and the maverick. And I think this is like kind of a division of labour, if you think about it, because you need both. So we need lots of people doing the conservative stuff, doing the normal science, in the sort of Lacanian sense, right? So they're actually just pursuing the paradigm, but you also need the Einsteins who are questioning the fun. But it's harder to be. So mavericks do, they get their grants. It's a bit harder and so on, but also they get, in terms of praise, and they get magnitudes of praise way beyond anyone else does. So, as it were, as a scientist, you have to sort of weigh it up. Conservative route has easy results, easy grants, and so on, but the plaudits are low. Or you can go down the maverick route. Grants are harder, funding is harder, positions are harder, but if it works out, big prizes. So it does kind of reward it. The issues there aren't so much structural, and it's not like you would think that the person is. I mean, even there though, it is important that the person has to have some viable means of opposing the inverted commas structural, because obviously they're saying there isn't a structural truth, right? A structural limit. So it wouldn't be like the historian case where someone says, you know what, I'm going to find out what Caesar has for breakfast, even though there's no way of doing such a thing, but I'm going to do it. It wouldn't be like that. It'd be more like someone saying, like Einstein, let's imagine space and time aren't constants, but the speed of light is. Let's work out what that happens then. It's more like that. So there's a viable means and a viable knowledge base to make sense of what that inquiry would be. Yeah, so I think this is okay. You're right. If it had the result that people who question apparently structural limitations were thereby doing something wrong, epistemically, that would be a bad result. But I don't think it does have that result.
So I guess to follow up on that, can we ever know if something is truly a structural limit then, or is that something we just have to take normatively? Because especially in physics, there's many people who took a lot of things as structural limits that were later found wrong. So is there a way we can tell that something is a structural limit, or should we question that itself?
It's the human epistemic condition that we're fallible. Right? So that has to be built into everything. I mean, what I want to say is incoherent is the idea of, at the same time, thinking there's a structural limit, and that you can inquire beyond the structural limit. That's incoherent. But what isn't incoherent is to think that what everyone thinks is a structural limit isn't really a structural limit. That's not incoherent. And in fact, if you buy into the fallibility of human belief, well then it ought to be possible that sometimes everyone's wrong. Indeed, the history of science is full of such cases where everyone's wrong about something or And I think this is why we do have, science. I mean, you can't be a complete maverick. You've got to have some means for making sense of your inquiry. But insofar as you do, science accommodates people like that. I mean, they do exist, right? And they can get grants. And if it all works out, they get big prizes. So there's a structure in place to allow that kind of maverick. Not the kind of maverick that just sort of goes for crazy ideas and has no basis for it, but the maverick that has some plausible story about why we might be fundamentally wrong about X, Y, and Z, and how we might find that out. So, but yeah, if we never get, we can never, I mean, certainly with empirical matters, we'll never be absolutely certain about anything.
We have time for one more question. Matthew?
So what I have for ignorance from the presentation is that it's a sort of lack of epistemic good, and then that's a sort of fill-in-the-blank thing for whatever you want that to be.
Yeah.
And it's also that you're culpable for this. And I'm not sure if you went too in detail about culpability. How much of a fill-in-the-blank sort of thing is that? And also, is there an overlap between this epistemic good and culpability? Like, if the epistemic good is we ought to seek truth, and culpability is we ought to seek certain truths, then why not just say that the epistemic good is whatever culpability tells us to aim at?
Good. Yeah, that's a really good point. So you're right. So on the one hand, to fill in the blank about the epistemic good, that's the epistemic axiology bit. And then the thought was, when it comes to culpability, there's also a fill in the blank, but it's connected to the first fill in the blank. It's because, well, whatever culpability is, it's an intellectual failing inquiry. How do we understand that? Well, that's relative to what we think the fundamental epistemic good is, because that's what inquiry is geared at. This is what I was saying about, we can't, as it were, just say, we have some notion of culpabilities in play here, but how you fill that out depends on what you think inquiry is aimed at in the first place. So it depends on what so if you think it's truth, for example, well then the intellectual failing will be understood in terms of, a failing of getting at the truth. So that's what, it's important that it's an intellectual failing as well. It's not any old kind of culpability. So, again, from axiology to ethics now, intellectual ethics. Think about the virtuous person. They're striving towards the truth. Why do they strive towards the truth? Because the truth is the fundamental good. They're manifesting certain kinds of motivations and dispositions, and we evaluate them in terms of whether or not they are good at getting this good, the truth. Right? And relatedly, we criticize them in terms of whether they fail to do that. So, we have a kind of grip on that. Like when we were talking about the case of the pointless truths, we've got this idea, there are certain things, they're truths, but we don't go for them. Why don't we go for them? Because we care about the truth. And there's nothing paradoxical about that. It's just caring about the truth doesn't mean caring about all truth. It means caring about the truth in a selective way. It also means caring about the truth in a particular kind of way as well. So, we fill in the gaps by giving an account of what the fundamental epistemic good is, give an account of intellectual ethics. And then, if we've done it right, ignorance falls out of it because it tells us what kind of culpability is in play, whereas that's understood relative to what it is we're trying to achieve when we inquire. That answers at least half your question. I think there was another bit as well.
I think you addressed the previous bit about, is there an overlap between epistemic good and culpability? Like, if we're culpable to only seek out certain truths, then why not just say the epistemic good is those certain truths and it's relative per person?
Yeah. I mean, one way of thinking about this, if you just, sort of kind of framework I find plausible, which is an old-fashioned one, Aristotelian actually. Truth is the fundamental epistemic good. Intellectual virtues involve motivation for the truth. The two mixes up quite nicely. And then you just tell a story about what it is to be a virtuous subject from an intellectual point of view. And relatedly, you have a story about what it is to be adviseful. What it wasn't, maybe you're familiar with him. The Aristotelian picture, I think, is very powerful. Intellectual virtues lie between two vices, a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. So, what are these good traits of a good inquirer? They're things like intellectual humility, intellectual tenacity, intellectual courage, integrity, and so on. And for all these traits, we can imagine, this practical wisdom is about navigating between the two extremes. Just as courage is between the two vices of rashness on the one hand, excess, and cowardice on the other, deficiency. Intellectual courage lies between the two vices too. Same with, being open-minded, being humble. It's like, it's not just deferring to everybody, right? That's obviously not a virtue, that's a vice. But equally, being arrogant and not listening to anybody, that's not a virtue either. So we've got this idea of navigating between the two, and the idea is, how do you do that? We have practical wisdom geared towards a certain good, the truth. And ignorance is when you fail to do that. So.
That completes our Q&A panel. I would like to give a tremendous thanks to Professor Pritchard for his speaker talk.